The afternoon sun filtered through Morrison's supermarket as 72-year-old Eleanor Brooks selected ingredients for her late husband's favorite stew. The payment terminal glitched, and the cashier told her to wait by the exit while the system reset. Eleanor settled into a chair, her cane resting against her knee, completely unaware that Officer Bradley Kane had just walked through the entrance, his eyes narrowing with an assumption that would cost the city $1.5 million. Because what Kane didn't know as he approached this quiet elderly woman with groceries was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He was about to arrest a retired judge who had spent 40 years fighting corruption. And today, Eleanor Brooks was going to remind an entire city what real justice looks like. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of Morrison's supermarket, casting long shadows across the polished linoleum floors. Eleanor Brooks moved slowly down the produce aisle, her wooden cane tapping a steady rhythm against the ground. At 72 years old, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent decades commanding courtrooms, even though retirement had softened her edges just slightly. Today marked 15 years since her husband William had passed. Every year on this date, Ellie made the same pilgrimage to this grocery store to buy ingredients for his favorite beef stew. Carrots, potatoes, celery, a good cut of chuck roast. The ritual brought her comfort, a way of keeping his memory alive in something as simple as a meal she would eat alone. "Judge Brooks, good to see you today," called out Mrs. Patterson from behind the deli counter. The older woman waved a pair of tongs cheerfully. Ellie smiled and nodded. "Good afternoon, Dorothy. How's that grandson of yours doing? Just made the honor roll again, thanks to you writing that recommendation letter last year. He earned it himself. I just put it on paper." The store had been part of Ellie's neighborhood for more than 3 decades. She knew the managers, the regular cashiers, the people who stocked shelves at dawn. This place felt like an extension of home, familiar and safe. As she turned down the canned goods aisle, Ellie noticed a younger man in a security uniform following a few steps behind her. He was new, someone she didn't recognize. His eyes tracked her movements with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. When she paused to read a label, he stopped too. When she moved forward, he resumed walking. Ellie tried to ignore it. Perhaps he was just doing his job, though she couldn't imagine what about a 72-year-old woman buying stew ingredients seemed suspicious. Near the meat counter, she spotted Marcus Doyle arranging packages of ground beef. Marcus was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of young man who always said good morning and actually meant it. He had worked at Morrison's for nearly 5 years, and Ellie appreciated his gentle demeanor. "Miss Eleanor," Marcus said softly, nodding with respect. "Marcus, how's your mother's hip doing after that surgery?" His face brightened. "Much better. Thank you for asking. She's walking without the walker now." "That's wonderful news. You tell her I said hello." "Will do, ma'am." Ellie continued shopping, placing items carefully into her cart. Her hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and the cane made maneuvering awkward, but she managed. Independence mattered to her. She had fought too hard in life to surrender simple freedoms like buying her own groceries. By the time she reached the checkout lane, her cart held everything she needed. The cashier, a young woman named Brenda, greeted her warmly and began scanning items. Ellie reached into her purse for her debit card, pulling out the worn leather wallet William had given her on their 30th anniversary. She inserted the card into the payment terminal and waited. The screen flickered, then displayed an error message. Brenda frowned and tried again. Same result. "I'm so sorry, Judge Brooks. This machine's been acting up all day. Let me call someone to reset it real quick." "That's fine, dear. Take your time." Brenda picked up the phone and spoke to someone in the back. While they waited, one of Ellie's grocery bags began to tear along the bottom seam. A can of tomatoes rolled precariously close to the edge of the counter. "Oh, here, let me get you a new bag," Brenda said, reaching under the register. As she did, the torn bag gave way completely. Cans clattered onto the counter, and a jar of beef broth tumbled to the floor, thankfully not breaking. Ellie tried to catch the items, but moved too slowly. "Goodness, I'm making a mess," Ellie said with an embarrassed laugh. "Not at all, not at all. Here, why don't you take these bags over to that table by the exit?" You can reorganize everything there while I get this terminal working. It'll just take a minute. Ellie hesitated. Are you sure? Absolutely. You've been standing long enough. Go sit down, and I'll wave you over once it's ready. Grateful, Ellie gathered the grocery bags, balancing them awkwardly against her cane, and made her way toward the small cafe table near the exit doors. Her knees ached from standing, and the idea of sitting down for a moment felt like a blessing. She set the bags on the table and lowered herself into the chair with a quiet sigh of relief. From where she sat, she could see Brenda on the phone, nodding and gesturing at the payment terminal. It would only be a few minutes. Ellie didn't notice Officer Bradley Kane walk through the entrance. Kane was 42, broad-shouldered, with the kind of rigid posture that suggested he took himself very seriously. He wore his uniform even when off-duty, as if the badge and gun were extensions of his identity. Today, he had stopped by Morrison's to grab an energy drink and a sandwich, the same routine he followed most afternoons. He walked with a swagger, chest out, jaw set. People moved out of his way instinctively, though whether out of respect or unease was hard to say. Kane's eyes swept the store with habitual suspicion. It was a reflex he had developed over 2 decades in law enforcement, always watching, always assessing. His gaze landed on Ellie, sitting near the exit with grocery bags beside her. He stopped mid-stride, an elderly black woman, bags of groceries, sitting by the exit, no cashier nearby. Kane's jaw tightened. He didn't think. He reacted. Marcus Doyle, restocking a nearby shelf, saw Kane's expression shift and immediately felt a knot form in his stomach. He had seen that look before. It meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Marcus hurried toward Kane, wiping his hands on his apron. Officer Kane, hey, just so you know. Kane held up a hand, cutting him off without even looking at him. Step back. Sir, I just wanted to explain. I said step back. Kane's voice was sharp, authoritative. Marcus froze, his words dying in his throat. He wanted to speak up, to tell Kane that Ellie was waiting to pay, that the terminal was broken, that this was all a misunderstanding. But the intensity in Kane's eyes silenced him. Marcus took a reluctant step backward, fear prickling along his spine. Kane approached Ellie with deliberate, heavy steps. Ellie looked up as a shadow fell across the table. She smiled politely, assuming he was another customer or perhaps store security. Ma'am, I need you to stand up, Kane said coldly. Ellie blinked in confusion. I'm sorry. I said stand up. Hands where I can see them. The tone of his voice sent a chill through her. This wasn't a request. It was a command. Ellie's smile faded, replaced by cautious concern. Officer, I'm just waiting for the cashier to fix the payment machine. I was reorganizing my... You're sitting by the exit with unpaid merchandise. That's theft. No, you misunderstand. The cashier told me to wait here while she... Stand up. Now. Ellie's heart began to race. She gripped her cane and tried to rise, but her knees protested. The sudden movement made her unsteady, and the cane slipped from her hand, clattering loudly onto the tile floor. Other shoppers turned to look. A mother with 2 young children stopped mid-aisle. An elderly man with a cart full of canned goods stood frozen, watching. I need to sit down, please. My knees. I gave you an order, Kane snapped. Are you refusing to comply? I'm not refusing anything. I just need a moment. Kane reached down and grabbed Ellie's wrist, yanking her upward. The force sent a sharp pain shooting through her arm. She gasped, stumbling forward as her body struggled to support itself without the cane. Please, you're hurting me, Ellie said, her voice strained but calm. Should have thought about that before you tried to steal. I didn't steal anything. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Whispers rippled through the aisles. Someone near the bakery section pulled out their phone and started recording. Karen Walsh, a middle-aged woman with a sharp eye for injustice and a sizable social media following, stood near the produce section. She had been picking out apples when she heard the commotion. Now, she held up her phone, switching to a live stream. Folks, you're not going to believe what I'm seeing right now, she whispered into the camera. An officer is arresting an elderly woman over groceries at Morrison supermarket. Kane twisted Ellie's arms behind her back. She winced, her wrists protesting the rough treatment. The surgical scars from an old injury, hidden beneath her sleeves, throbbed with renewed pain. "You're making a mistake," Ellie said quietly, her voice steady despite the pain. "My name is Eleanor Brooks. I'm a retired judge. I was waiting to pay." Kane let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "A judge? Right? You people always think throwing out some fancy name is going to get you out of trouble." A hush fell over the crowd. Several people recognized her name. Mrs. Patterson from the deli counter gasped audibly. An older man near the pharmacy whispered to his wife, "That's Judge Brooks. She presided over the Henderson case years ago." But no one spoke up. The sight of Kane's uniform, the authority in his stance, the gun on his hip, it all created an invisible barrier that kept people silent, even those who knew the truth. Marcus stood near the canned goods, his hands trembling. He wanted to shout, to run forward, to tell Kane he was wrong. But fear rooted him in place. He had seen officers like Kane before, had heard stories of people who spoke up and found themselves in handcuffs too. Kane pulled out his handcuffs and snapped them onto Ellie's wrists. The metal bit into her skin, tight and unforgiving. "These are too tight," Ellie said, her voice still controlled but edged with pain. "Maybe don't resist next time." "I wasn't resisting." Kane ignored her. He grabbed her arm and steered her toward the exit, pushing her ahead of him. Rain had started to fall outside, heavy droplets drumming against the pavement. The automatic doors slid open, and Kane marched Ellie toward his patrol car parked near the curb. The crowd followed at a distance, phones raised, recording every moment. Karen's live stream was already being shared. Comments flooded in. "Is that really a judge? This is insane. Someone stop him." Kane opened the back door of the cruiser and guided Ellie inside with a rough shove. She stumbled, nearly hitting her head on the door frame, and landed awkwardly on the hard plastic seat. The handcuffs dug deeper in her wrists. Through the rain-streaked window, Ellie stared out at the gathering crowd, faces blurred by water and glass. She saw Marcus standing in the doorway of the store, his expression anguished. She saw Karen still recording, her phone held high. Ellie closed her eyes and took a slow breath. Memories surfaced unbidden. She was 19 again, marching through the streets with signs demanding justice. She was 25, sitting in a segregated diner, refusing to leave. She was 30, standing before a courtroom, sworn in as one of the first black female judges in the state. She had survived worse than this. But the indignity of it, the casual cruelty, the assumption of guilt based on nothing but her presence and her skin, it cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Kane climbed into the driver's seat and picked up his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I've got a suspect in custody for shoplifting at Morrison Supermarket. Subject resisted and refused to comply. Transporting to the station now." Ellie's jaw tightened. Resisted. Refused. Neither was true, but his words would become the official record unless someone spoke up. The drive to the precinct took less than 10 minutes. Kane said nothing the entire way. Ellie watched the familiar streets roll past, the neighborhood she had lived in for decades, now seen through the cage of a police car. At the station, Kane pulled her out of the car with the same roughness. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in stark, sterile brightness. Officers glanced up from their desks, curious but detached. At the booking desk, a young rookie officer took Ellie's information. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as her name appeared on the screen. His eyes widened. "Wait, Eleanor Brooks? As in Judge Eleanor Brooks?" Kane scoffed. "Don't fall for it. She's lying. Sir, it says right here." "I don't care what it says. Process her." The rookie hesitated, glancing nervously between Kane and the screen. Whispers began to spread through the station. An older officer near the coffee machine pulled out his phone, quickly searching Ellie's name. His face went pale. Captain Regina Ward's office door opened. She was a stern woman in her mid-50s, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her uniform immaculate. She had been reviewing reports when the murmurs reached her ears. She stepped out and saw Ellie standing at the booking desk, hands still cuffed, her dignity intact despite everything. Ward's stomach dropped. She recognized Eleanor Brooks immediately. Every officer in the city should have. Brooks was a legend, a woman who had shaped the legal landscape for decades. And now she stood in Ward's precinct, arrested like a common criminal. "Someone give me an explanation," Ward said, her voice tight. "Now." Kane stepped forward, chest puffed. "Captain, I apprehended a suspect attempting to leave a grocery store with unpaid merchandise. She resisted compliance and refused to cooperate." Ward's eyes narrowed. "Did you confirm the alleged theft?" Visual confirmation was sufficient. She was sitting by the exit with bags of groceries. "Did you speak to store employees?" Kane hesitated. The suspect's actions were clear. Ward closed her eyes briefly, a muscle in her jaw twitching. She could already see the disaster unfolding. If this had been recorded, if it went public, the department would be torn apart. "Uncuff her," Ward said quietly. "Captain, I don't think." "I said uncuff her." "Now." Kane reluctantly removed the handcuffs. Ellie rubbed her wrists gently, the skin red and tender. She looked at Captain Ward with calm, unreadable eyes. "Ma'am, I apologize for any misunderstanding," Ward began carefully. Ellie's gaze didn't waver. "This wasn't a misunderstanding, Captain. This was an assumption." Before Ward could respond, the precinct doors burst open. Maya Carter stormed in, her eyes blazing. At 26, Maya had her grandmother's fire wrapped in modern fury. She was a podcaster, an investigative journalist, and she had seen the live stream while recording an episode. The moment she recognized her grandmother's voice, she had dropped everything and run. "Where is she?" Maya demanded, her voice echoing through the station. Ward turned. "Miss, you need to calm down." "Don't tell me to calm down. You arrested my grandmother for buying groceries." Maya spotted Ellie and rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her. "Grandma, are you okay? Did they hurt you?" Ellie patted Maya's back gently. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little sore." Maya pulled back, her eyes scanning Ellie's wrists. The redness was already darkening into bruises. Rage flashed across Maya's face. "I want a lawyer. I want a formal complaint filed. And I want every single person involved held accountable." Kane stepped forward, his voice defensive. "I had probable cause." "Probable cause?" Maya turned on him, her voice sharp. "Probable cause to assault a 72-year-old woman who was waiting to pay for groceries? I don't have to explain myself to you. You will when this goes public. And trust me, it's already public." Maya pulled out her phone and showed them Karen's live stream. It had already been viewed 2 million times. Comments flooded in by the second. Hashtag Justice for Judge Brooks was trending. Ward's face went ashen. Kane's bravado faltered just slightly. Ellie stood quietly between them, watching the chaos unfold with the calm of someone who had weathered far worse storms. But inside, her mind was working. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had been treated this way and had no platform, no voice, no Maya to fight for them. A nurse arrived to check Ellie's wrists. She gently examined the bruising and asked Ellie if she had any prior injuries. Ellie hesitated, then mentioned old surgical scars from a fall years ago. The nurse made careful notes, her expression growing more concerned. Kane, standing nearby, muttered, "Probably faking it." The nurse shot him a withering look. "These bruises are real, and these old scars suggest prior trauma to the area. Rough handling could have caused significant pain." Kane turned away, jaw clenched. While the nurse worked, Marcus Doyle appeared at the precinct doors, clutching a folder. He looked terrified but determined. Maya noticed him first. "Marcus?" she said, recognizing him from the store. He approached hesitantly. "I have the security logs and the receipt fragments." Judge Brooks was telling the truth. The payment terminal malfunctioned. Brenda told her to wait by the table. Maya took the folder, flipping through it quickly. Her eyes lit up. "This is exactly what we need." Marcus nodded, then glanced nervously at Kane. "I wanted to tell him to the store, but he wouldn't listen." Kane's face flushed with anger, but he said nothing. Captain Ward took the folder from Maya, scanning the documents. She let out a long breath. This was even worse than she had thought. Clear evidence of a malfunction, employee testimony, and Kane had ignored all protocol. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Mayor Silvia Ortega. Ward stepped away to take the call. "Yes, Mayor." Ortega's voice was clipped and tense. Regina, I just saw a viral video involving one of your officers and a very prominent retired judge. Tell me you're handling this. I'm working on it now. Work faster. We're 8 months from an election. I can't have this turning into a scandal. With respect, Mayor, this already is a scandal. Then contain it, quietly, before it gets worse. The call ended. Ward stared at her phone, frustration simmering beneath her calm exterior. Contain it, as if justice could be quietly swept under a rug. She returned to find Ellie preparing to leave. Maya had draped her grandmother's coat over her shoulders and was guiding her toward the door. Judge Brooks, Ward called out. May I speak with you privately? Ellie paused. Maya started to object, but Ellie raised a hand. It's all right. In Ward's office, the two women sat across from each other. Ward folded her hands on the desk, choosing her words carefully. I want to apologize on behalf of the department. Ellie's expression remained neutral. An apology doesn't erase what happened, Captain. I know, but I want you to understand that not everyone here supports what occurred today. Then what will you do about it? Ward hesitated. I'm limited in what I can do without formal complaints and investigations. That sounds like the same excuse people have used for decades to avoid change. Ward flinched. She knew Ellie was right. Ellie stood abruptly, leaning on her cane. I've seen worse cover-ups, Captain. I watched good people stay silent because it was easier. I won't be one of them, and I hope you won't either. She left the office, leaving Ward alone with those words. Outside, Maya helped Ellie into her car. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick under the streetlights. We need to take you to the hospital. Get those wrists checked properly. I'm fine, Maya. You're not fine. Ellie turned to her granddaughter. I know, but we don't react in anger. We respond with action. What kind of action? We do this the right way. Later that night, Ellie sat in her living room, staring at the television as news channels replayed Karen's video. Commentators debated. Some defended Kane. Others called for his termination. A soft knock came at the door. Henry Lawson stood on her porch. Saw the news, Henry said gently. Thought you might want some company. They sat together in dim light. Henry didn't ask questions. He simply offered his presence. After a while, Ellie spoke. Do you remember Officer Kane's father? Henry's expression shifted. Yes, I remember him. He was involved in the protests back in the 70s. I presided over one of the misconduct cases. Kane's father was never held fully accountable. The department protected him, and now his son carries that legacy. Henry leaned forward. Ellie, you need to be careful. Kane isn't just angry. Someone's been shielding him for years. Who? I don't know yet, but I'll find out. After Henry left, Ellie picked up her phone and made a call. Daniel Holt's office. This is Eleanor Brooks. I need to speak with the city attorney. Daniel came on the line, his voice cautious. Judge Brooks, I heard about what happened. I'm very sorry. I'm not calling for sympathy. I'm filing a civil rights lawsuit against Officer Kane and the city for wrongful arrest and excessive force. Silence. Perhaps we could discuss a resolution privately. There will be no private resolution. This is about accountability. I see. Then I'll expect formal notice. Ellie ended the call. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision. Maya arrived the next morning with coffee and determination. She spread her laptop and notes across Ellie's kitchen table. I've been digging, Maya said. Kane has had excessive force complaints before. Multiple, but they all disappeared from the official record. Someone's been protecting him. Exactly, and I'm going to find out who. Ellie sipped her coffee, watching her granddaughter work. Maya had her fire, her refusal to accept injustice quietly. It filled Ellie with both pride and worry. Be careful, Maya. People who hide things don't appreciate those who seek them out. I'm always careful, Grandma. That night, Maya published a podcast episode detailing everything she had uncovered. The episode went viral within hours. News outlets picked it up. Social media erupted. Kane's name trended alongside Ellie's. At the precinct, Kane sat in the break room, scrolling through his phone. Every article, every post, every comment felt like a personal attack. His jaw clenched tighter with each word. Captain Ward approached him. Kane, I need you to take some leave. Paid. Until this gets sorted. I didn't do anything wrong. That's not the point. You're a liability right now. Kane stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I'm being punished for doing my job. You arrested a retired judge without confirming the facts. That's not doing your job. That's recklessness. Kane stormed out, his anger simmering just below the surface. Across town, Daniel Holt sat in his office, staring at the formal lawsuit that had just been delivered. Eleanor Brooks versus the city and Officer Bradley Kane. The claims were detailed, damning, and entirely justified. His phone rang. Mayor Ortega. Tell me you can make this go away, she said without preamble. She's not interested in settling quietly. Everyone has a price. Not her. Ortega was silent for a moment. Then prepare for a fight. Because if she wins, it opens the door to every other case we've buried. Daniel hung up, his stomach churning. He had spent his career navigating political waters, balancing justice with pragmatism. But this case felt different. This felt like a line drawn in the sand, and he wasn't sure which side he wanted to stand on. Ellie spent the evening alone, cooking William's stew. The familiar motions soothed her, chopping vegetables, browning meat, letting everything simmer slowly. She lit a candle beside his photograph and whispered, I hope you be proud of what I'm doing. The silence answered, but she felt his presence in the warmth of the kitchen, in the scent of rosemary and thyme. Outside, the city hummed with tension. Two sides forming. Those who believed in Ellie, those who defended Kane. The middle ground was shrinking, and in the shadows, powerful people watched, knowing that if Ellie's lawsuit succeeded, the past they had worked so hard to bury would rise to the surface. The next morning, Maya received an anonymous voicemail. The voice was distorted, threatening. Stop digging. This is your only warning. Maya's hand shook. She contacted a security company and had cameras installed. At Morrison's supermarket, Marcus arrived for his shift to find the manager waiting. Marcus, we need to talk about you going to the police station. Marcus's heart sank. I was just telling the truth. I understand. But corporate got calls. Pressure from people who don't want this store involved in controversy. Are you firing me? The manager sighed heavily. No, you did the right thing. But keep a low profile. No more interviews. No more public statements. Marcus nodded slowly. Tell the truth, but do it quietly. The same compromise people had been making for generations. Across town, Henry Lawson opened a locked drawer and pulled out a file from the 1970s. One photograph showed Henry in uniform testifying before a commission investigating police brutality. Another showed Officer Thomas Kane, Bradley's father, leaving a courthouse after being acquitted of excessive force charges. Henry had testified against Thomas Kane. When the system failed to hold him accountable, Henry watched the man return to duty, protected by the department. Now history was repeating itself with Thomas's son wearing the same badge. Henry closed the file carefully. If Ellie was going to fight this battle, she deserved to know the full history. At City Hall, Mayor Ortega reviewed polling data. Her approval ratings had dropped 3 points. Her chief of staff entered. The opposition is calling for an investigation. Announce a review committee. Make it thorough, but keep it contained. Ortega called a donor. We have a problem. Handle it quietly. At the precinct, Captain Ward combed through old files. Kane's record should have shown 6 complaints. It showed 1 reprimand. Someone had scrubbed it clean. Ward made copies and stored them securely. These documents could change everything. Back home, Ellie sat in William's chair, thinking about people who faced similar injustices with no voice to fight back. Maya arrived with Chinese takeout. They ate in comfortable silence. Grandma, do you ever get scared? Every day. But fear isn't the enemy. Silence is. Maya smiled. That's my next episode title. Outside, the city continued its rhythms. Beneath the surface, something shifted, and at the center stood Eleanor Brooks, ready to prove the system could work or expose it. Justice had finally come for its reckoning. The lawsuit hit the news cycle like a thunderclap. Within hours, every major outlet covered the story. Eleanor Brooks, a retired judge with an impeccable record spanning 4 decades, was suing the city and Officer Bradley Kane for wrongful arrest and excessive force. The amount she sought was undisclosed, but legal experts speculated it could reach into the millions. Daniel Holt sat in his office. The lawsuit documents spread across his mahogany desk. The claims were meticulously detailed, each one supported by witness statements, medical records, and video evidence. He had handled difficult cases before, but this one felt different. This wasn't about legal strategy or political maneuvering. This was about truth, and truth had a way of exposing everything. His phone buzzed. Mayor Ortega. Daniel, we need to talk, she said without greeting. My office. 20 minutes. The line went dead before he could respond. 20 minutes later, Daniel stood in the mayor's office while Ortega paced behind her desk like a caged animal. We need to settle this quietly, she said. Offer her whatever she wants. Money, apology, disciplinary action against Kane. Whatever it takes to make this disappear before it goes to trial. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Mayor, with all due respect, Judge Brooks has made it clear she's not interested in a quiet settlement. Everyone has a price, Daniel. Find hers. I don't think you understand. This isn't about money for her. It's about accountability. Ortega stopped pacing and fixed him with a hard stare. Then make her understand that accountability comes in many forms. A settlement can include reforms, training programs, oversight committees. We can give her everything she wants without dragging this through a public trial. Daniel nodded slowly, though doubt gnawed at him. I'll reach out to her. Do it quickly. Every day this stays in the headlines. We lose ground. That afternoon, Daniel arrived at Ellie's modest home. She answered the door herself, leaning on her cane, her expression pleasant but guarded. Mr. Holt, I wasn't expecting you. I apologize for dropping by unannounced, Judge Brooks. I was hoping we could talk. Ellie studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in. They sat in her living room, surrounded by photographs of her late husband, family gatherings, and various commendations from her years on the bench. Daniel felt the weight of her legacy in every frame. The city is prepared to offer a substantial settlement, he began carefully. Along with a formal apology, disciplinary measures against Officer Kane, and funding for police reform initiatives. Ellie's expression didn't change. How substantial? We're authorized to go as high as necessary to resolve this matter privately. Privately, Ellie repeated, the word hanging in the air like smoke. Which means no trial, no public testimony, no official record of what happened. It means resolving this in a way that brings real change without the uncertainty of litigation. Ellie folded her hands in her lap, her gaze steady. Mr. Holt, I've watched this city bury uncomfortable truths for decades. Cases that disappeared, complaints that vanished, officers protected while victims were silenced. You're asking me to participate in that same system. I'm asking you to consider whether public confrontation is truly the best path to justice. Justice delayed is justice denied, Mr. Holt, and silence bought is justice delayed indefinitely. She leaned forward slightly. I'm going to trial, not because I want confrontation, but because some truths need to be spoken aloud, in public, where they can't be edited or forgotten. Daniel felt something shift inside him. He recognized the quiet conviction in her voice. It was the same tone she must have used in her courtroom, the kind that made lawyers and defendants alike understand they were in the presence of someone who valued truth above convenience. I understand, he said softly, and for what it's worth, I respect your decision. Ellie's expression softened slightly. I believe you do, but respect and action are different things, Mr. Holt. When the time comes, you'll have to choose which side of history you want to stand on. As Daniel left, he felt the weight of her words settling into his bones. At the police precinct, Kane sat alone in the break room, scrolling through social media on his phone. Every post felt like a personal attack. Hashtags condemned him. Strangers called him a racist, a bully, a disgrace to the badge. His hands trembled as he read comment after comment. The worst part wasn't the anger directed at him. It was the people defending him. White supremacist groups had adopted him as a symbol. Far-right commentators praised his tough stance. Every time someone defended him for the wrong reasons, Kane felt sicker. This wasn't who he wanted to be. Captain Ward found him there, his jaw clenched, eyes red. Kane, We need to talk. He looked up, anger flashing across his face. About what? About how I'm being thrown under the bus for doing my job. You didn't do your job. You made assumptions without confirming facts. You ignored witnesses. You used excessive force on a 72-year-old woman. She was shoplifting. She was waiting to pay. Ward's voice rose, surprising them both. She took a breath, steadying herself. Look, I'm not here to debate what happened. I'm here to tell you that Internal Affairs is opening a formal investigation. You need to cooperate fully. Kane stood abruptly. They're setting me up. All of them. They need someone to blame, so they picked me. No one set you up, Bradley. You did this to yourself. Ward's tone softened slightly. And until you accept that, nothing's going to change. She paused at the door, then turned back. Your father's record is being reviewed too. Everything's coming to light. If there's anything you want to tell me before Internal Affairs finds it, now's the time. Kane's face went pale. My father was a good cop. Was he? Ward asked quietly. Or is that just what you were told? Kane stormed out without another word, Ward's question echoing in his mind. That evening, Maya sat in her apartment, editing her latest podcast episode. The audio of her grandmother's arrest played through her headphones, and every time she heard Ellie's calm voice asking for a cane, Maya felt rage rise in her throat. She had titled the episode The Arrest That Exposed a System. In it, she traced patterns of complaints against Kane that had mysteriously vanished from official records. She included audio testimony from former officers who admitted they had been pressured to drop complaints. She played clips of legal experts explaining how systemic protection of bad officers undermined public trust. Her phone rang. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Hello. Heavy breathing on the other end, then a distorted voice. You should have stopped when you were warned. Maya's blood ran cold. Who is this? The line went dead. Her hand shook as she set down the phone. This was the second threat. Someone was watching her, tracking her work, trying to intimidate her into silence. She immediately called the security company and upgraded her system further. Cameras now covered every angle of her apartment building's entrance. Motion sensors lined her windows. She installed a panic button by her bed and another by her desk. She wasn't paranoid. She was prepared. Before publishing the episode, Maya called her grandmother. I'm getting threats, she admitted. Anonymous calls. I think someone's trying to scare me off. Ellie was quiet for a moment. Do you want to stop? No, Maya said firmly. But I wanted you to know, in case something happens. Nothing will happen. But Maya, I need you to be smart. Don't go anywhere alone. Vary your routine. And if you ever feel unsafe, you call the police immediately. The police are part of the problem, Grandma. Not all of them. Captain Ward has been fair. If you need help, call her directly. After they hung up, Maya published her episode. It included interviews with Morrison's employees who had witnessed the arrest, legal experts analyzing the lawsuit's implications, and a heartbreaking clip of Ellie describing how the handcuffs had aggravated her old wrist injury. Within 3 hours, the episode had been downloaded over 1 million times. Comments flooded in. Most were supportive, but some were vicious, threatening, filled with racial slurs and violent imagery. Maya reported the worst ones to the platform, but knew it wouldn't stop them. The internet had given cowards a megaphone, and they were using it. The next morning, Jamal Richards, the local reporter who had been following the story closely, called Maya. I found something, he said without preamble. About Kane's father. We need to meet. They met at a coffee shop downtown, tucked into a corner booth away from windows. Jamal was in his mid-30s, lean and intense, with the kind of relentless energy that made him an excellent investigative journalist. He slid a folder across the table. I've been digging into Thomas Kane's service record. It wasn't easy. A lot of it was archived, some of it deliberately misfiled. But I found it. Inside were newspaper clippings from the 1970s, articles about police brutality during civil rights protests, photographs that made Maya's stomach turn. One showed Officer Thomas Kane in riot gear, nightstick raised above a young black woman covering her head. Another showed protesters with bloodied faces being dragged away by officers in formation. Thomas Kane was involved in some of the most violent crackdowns of that era, Jamal explained, his voice low. There were at least a dozen complaints filed against him. Excessive force, racial targeting, intimidation of witnesses. And guess who presided over one of the misconduct hearings? My grandmother, Maya whispered. Exactly. Judge Eleanor Brooks heard the case in 1976. She ruled against him, recommended immediate suspension and mandatory retraining. But the police union fought back hard. The department's leadership at the time was old guard, resistant to any accountability. They buried her recommendation. Jamal pulled out another document. This is the official record of that hearing. It shows Judge Brooks's ruling. But this, he tapped another paper, is an internal memo from 3 months later. It shows the department quietly reinstating Kane with full back pay and expunging the complaint from his record. How is that legal? Maya asked. It probably wasn't. But who was going to challenge it? The civil rights movement was losing momentum. The city wanted to move on. And Thomas Kane stayed on the force, eventually retired with full honors and a generous pension. Maya stared at her father's photograph. Bradley Kane had his father's eyes, the same hard set to his jaw. Bradley grew up believing his father was a hero. Worse than that, Jamal said. I talked to some retired officers who remember Thomas Kane. They said he was bitter about Judge Brooks for the rest of his career. He told anyone who would listen that she was an activist judge out to destroy good cops. That narrative became gospel in certain circles. So Bradley inherited his father's resentment. Generational trauma, Jamal said, passed down like a family heirloom. Thomas Kane filled his son's head with stories about being persecuted by a black judge who didn't understand what it meant to keep order. Bradley never questioned it. Why would he? It was his father. Maya photographed every page with her phone. Can I use this? That's why I'm showing you. But Maya, be careful. The people who protected Thomas Kane are still around. Some of them have a lot of power. They won't want this coming out. Let them try to stop me, Maya said fiercely. Jamal smiled slightly. You sound like your grandmother. I'll take that as a compliment. Meanwhile, at Morrison's supermarket, the atmosphere had grown tense. Customers whispered whenever Marcus restocked shelves. Some thanked him for speaking up, shaking his hand, calling him brave. Others glared, muttering about troublemakers and people who didn't know their place. One afternoon, an older white man cornered Marcus near the dairy section. You know you're making it worse, right? The man said, his voice low and angry. That cop was just doing his job. Now you've got everyone thinking the whole police force is racist. Marcus kept his eyes down, continuing to stock milk cartons. I just told what I saw, sir. You should have kept your mouth shut. People like you always stirring up trouble. People like you. The words hung in the air, their meaning clear. The store manager appeared, his expression stern. Sir, if you're not here to shop, I'll have to ask you to leave. The man muttered something under his breath and walked away. The manager turned to Marcus. You okay? Marcus nodded, though his hands shook slightly. Yeah, I'm Phoenix. Come to my office when your shift ends. We need to talk. That evening, sitting across from the manager in the cramped back office, Marcus braced himself. Corporate is getting complaints, the manager said quietly, rubbing his temples. People threatening to boycott if we don't fire you. Saying you're bad for business, that you're making the store political. Marcus's stomach dropped. I told the truth. I know, and I'm not firing you. You did the right thing, Marcus. I want to be clear about that. The manager sighed heavily. But I need you to understand the position we're in. This store has been here for 40 years. We employ 60 people. We depend on the community, and we depend on staying out of political crossfire. So what are you asking? Keep a low profile for a while. No more interviews. No more public statements. Let the lawyers handle it from here. Can you do that? Marcus nodded slowly, a bitter taste in his mouth. Tell the truth, but do it quietly. Don't make waves. It was the same compromise people had been making for generations, the same advice his father had given him when he was younger. Speak up, but not too loud. Stand out, but not too much. Be brave, but don't pay the price. I understand, Marcus said quietly. The manager placed a hand on his shoulder. For what it's worth, my wife and I are on your side. What happened to Judge Brooks was wrong. I'm just trying to keep everyone employed while this plays out. After his shift, Marcus sat in his car in the parking lot, watching customers come and go. He thought about calling Maya, telling her about the pressure he was facing. But what good would it do? She had her own problems. He started his car and drove home, the weight of silence settling over him like a familiar blanket. That night, Henry Lawson sat in his modest home, the file from the 1970s open on his desk. The documents inside told a story that few people remembered, a story he had tried to forget. He had been young then, 32 years old, a military intelligence officer assigned to investigate corruption within local law enforcement. The assignment came after a series of violent protests had left dozens injured and 3 people dead. Federal authorities wanted to know if the police response had been appropriate or if there had been systematic abuse of power. Henry had spent 6 months compiling evidence. Interviews with protesters who described being beaten while handcuffed. Medical records showing injuries inconsistent with the official reports. Photographs that contradicted police testimony. And at the center of it all was Officer Thomas Kane, a man who seemed to take particular pleasure in cracking skulls. Henry had presented his findings to a review board. He had testified under oath about patterns of racial targeting, excessive force, and deliberate falsification of incident reports. He had expected justice. Instead, he got a lesson in how power protects itself. The review board thanked him for his service and quietly shelved his report. Political connections protected Kane. The police union rallied behind him. And when Judge Eleanor Brooks later presided over a misconduct hearing and ruled against Kane, the department simply ignored her recommendation. Henry's career stalled after that. His superiors made it clear that he had been too aggressive, too inflexible, too willing to make waves. He was reassigned to desk work, then encouraged to take early retirement. He left the military at 40, disillusioned and angry. But he had kept the file. Insurance, he told himself. Evidence, in case the day ever came when someone would finally listen. That day had arrived. He picked up his phone and dialed Ellie's number. "Henry," she answered. "It's late. Is everything all right? I have something you need to see," he said. "Documents from the investigation I conducted in the 70s. Evidence about Thomas Kane that was buried. Can I come by tomorrow?" "Of course." The next morning, Henry arrived with the file. He and Ellie sat at her kitchen table while she carefully reviewed each document. Her expression remained composed, but Henry saw the pain flicker in her eyes when she reached the photographs of beaten protesters, young faces swollen and bloodied. "I remember this hearing," she said softly, touching one of the documents. Thomas Kane sat in that courtroom with such arrogance. He truly believed he was untouchable. And the worst part is, he was right. He was, Henry said bitterly. The department made sure of it. "I thought my investigation would matter. I thought the truth would be enough." "The truth is never enough on its own," Ellie replied. "It needs people willing to speak it and people willing to hear it. You spoke it, Henry. The system failed to hear." She closed the file gently. "But now we have another chance. And this time, the system doesn't get to look away. I should have done more back then. Maybe if I had fought harder, found a way to force accountability, Bradley Kane would have grown up with a different legacy. Maybe none of this would have happened." Ellie reached across the table and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "We all carry regrets about what we could have done. But right now, we have a chance to do something. That's what matters. Your evidence shows a pattern. It shows that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was generational, and that matters in court. Will it be enough? It has to be, because if it's not, then nothing ever will be." At City Hall, Mayor Ortega met behind closed doors with a political donor named Robert Shun, a wealthy businessman with deep connections throughout the state. His donations had funded 3 of her campaigns, and he expected results. "This Brooks situation is becoming a problem," Ortega said, pacing behind her desk. "If she wins at trial, it opens the door to investigations into past cases. Cases we've worked hard to keep buried." Chun nodded slowly, his expression calculating. "I have people who can apply pressure. Legal pressure, financial pressure, media pressure. We can make her reconsider her position. She's already refused a settlement offer. Multiple times, in fact. Everyone has vulnerabilities, Sylvia. Family, reputation, legacy. Find hers and exploit it." Ortega hesitated, feeling the moral line she was about to cross. I don't want anything illegal. Nothing that could blow back on us later. Shin smiled coldly. Nothing illegal. Just strategic persuasion. Unknown to them, Captain Ward stood just outside the door, having arrived early for a scheduled meeting. She heard every word through the slight gap. Her jaw tightened. She pulled out her phone and started recording. That afternoon, Maya received an encrypted message from an anonymous source. It contained audio of Ortega's conversation with Chun. Maya's hand shook as she listened. She immediately forwarded it to Jamal, who verified its authenticity. Within hours, he published an explosive article detailing the mayor's attempt to pressure a lawsuit plaintiff. The city erupted. Protests formed outside City Hall. Citizens demanded Ortega's resignation. The opposition party called for investigations. Even Ortega's allies began distancing themselves. In her office, Ortega stared at her plummeting approval ratings, her face ashen. Her chief of staff stood nearby, equally pale. How did they get that recording? Ortega whispered. I don't know, but it doesn't matter now. The damage is done. At the precinct, Kane watched the chaos unfold on the news. He felt a strange mixture of vindication and dread. The system that had protected him was crumbling, but he was still part of that system. When it fell, he would fall with it. His phone rang. His mother. Bradley, we need to talk about your father. Not now, Mom. Yes, now. You need to hear the truth. Kane closed his eyes. What truth? Your father wasn't the hero you think he was. The things he did during those protests, the people he hurt, it was wrong. And that judge who ruled against him, she wasn't attacking him. She was holding him accountable. Kane felt something crack inside him. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I wanted to protect you from the pain. But I see now that silence only passes pain to the next generation. Kane hung up and sat in the darkness of his apartment, his entire worldview fracturing. Meanwhile, Chief Justice Langford arrived at Ellie's home, holding a sealed envelope. I owe you an explanation, he said when she answered the door. They sat in her living room, and Langford told her a story from 30 years earlier. He had been pressured to dismiss a case involving police corruption. If he refused, powerful people threatened to destroy his career and his family. Ellie, then a newer judge, had discovered what was happening and quietly took the case herself, absorbing the political backlash that should have fallen on him. You saved my career and never asked for anything in return, Langford said, his voice heavy with emotion. I've lived with that debt ever since. You didn't owe me anything, Ellie said gently. Yes, I did, and I still do. He handed her the envelope. Inside are copies of internal memos showing how the city has systematically protected certain officers for decades, including Bradley Kane and his father. I kept them all these years, insurance against the day I might need to fight back. That day is now. Ellie opened the envelope. The documents inside were damning. Patterns of complaints buried, investigations stopped, witnesses intimidated. A systemic cover-up spanning generations. This changes everything, she whispered. I know, and I'm prepared to testify to its authenticity. The next day, Daniel Holt received copies of the memos through official legal channels. He sat in his office, reading them with growing horror. Every case he had helped settle quietly. Every complaint he had helped dismiss. It was all part of a larger machine designed to protect itself at any cost. His phone rang. Ortega again. Daniel, I need you to discredit those memos. Call them fabricated, question their chain of custody, anything. Daniel stared at the documents in front of him. Ellie's words echoed in his mind. You'll have to choose which side of history you want to stand on. No, he said quietly. Excuse me. I said no. These documents are authentic. They show a pattern of corruption, and I won't be part of covering it up anymore. You're making a mistake, Daniel. Maybe, but it's the right mistake to make. He hung up and sat back in his chair, feeling lighter than he had in years. That evening, Marcus Doyle sat in his small apartment, watching the news coverage. The grocery clerk who had spoken up, they called him. A quiet hero in a story full of noise. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Thank you for your courage. He smiled slightly. Maybe making himself visible had been worth it, after all. At Ellie's home, she, Maya, and Henry sat together, reviewing the memos and preparing for the trial that now seemed inevitable. "This is bigger than I imagined," Maya said. "We're not just fighting Kane. We're fighting decades of systemic protection." "Which is exactly why we can't stop," Ellie replied. "This was never just about me. It was about every person who faced injustice and had no voice." Henry nodded. "And now that voice is getting louder." Ellie stood slowly, walking to the window. Outside, her quiet neighborhood looked peaceful, but she knew that beneath that peace, a battle was brewing. A battle between accountability and silence, between truth and comfort. She turned back to her granddaughter, an old friend. "Tomorrow, we file the amended complaint with all the new evidence, and then we prepare for the fight of our lives." Maya smiled fiercely. "Let them come." Across the city, in a darkened apartment, Kane stared at his father's memorial plaque. The words "dedicated service" seemed to mock him now. His entire identity had been built on a lie, a legacy that should have been a warning instead of a source of pride. He thought about the look in Ellie's eyes when he arrested her. Not fear, but disappointment, as if she had expected better from him, even as a stranger. Maybe she had been right to expect better. At City Hall, Ortega sat alone in her office as her staff packed up files. Calls for her resignation grew louder by the hour. Her political career, built on careful alliances and strategic silence, was unraveling. She had underestimated Eleanor Brooks. She had assumed an elderly woman would be easy to intimidate, easy to pay off, easy to silence. She had been catastrophically wrong. In newsrooms across the city, reporters scrambled to cover every new development. Jamal Richards worked late into the night, fact-checking sources, verifying documents. This was the story of his career, but more than that, it was a story that mattered. And at Morrison's supermarket, the payment terminal that had started everything sat repaired and functioning. A small malfunction that had exposed a massive system of injustice. Sometimes the smallest cracks reveal the deepest faults. Ellie lay in bed that night, exhausted but unable to sleep. She thought about William, about the life they had built together on the foundation of justice and fairness. She wondered what he would think of her now, at 72, preparing for legal battle. But she knew. He would tell her the same thing he always had. Do what's right, not what's easy. And that was exactly what she intended to do. The city watched, waited, and wondered what would come next. The lawsuit was no longer just about an arrest. It was about accountability, legacy, and whether the system could ever truly change. Eleanor Brooks had asked a simple question through her actions. Will justice prevail, or will silence win again? The answer would be decided in a courtroom, in front of the entire nation. And whatever that answer was, nothing would ever be the same. Following the explosive revelations about systemic corruption and Mayor Ortega's conspiracy, the trial moved forward with unprecedented public attention. Camera crews lined the courthouse steps. Protesters gathered on both sides, though Ellie's supporters now vastly outnumbered Kane's defenders. Daniel Holt stood at the courthouse steps early that morning, watching the crowd gather. His phone buzzed with another call from Ortega's office. He silenced it without answering. That chapter of his life was over. He had made his choice, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of compromise lift from his shoulders. Inside, he found Ellie already seated with Maya and Henry. She wore a simple navy suit, her silver hair pulled back elegantly. Despite everything, she radiated calm dignity. "Ready?" Daniel asked. Ellie smiled slightly. "I've been ready for 50 years, Mr. Holt. Today is just the culmination." Jury selection proved more challenging than expected. The case had saturated media coverage. Nearly every potential juror had seen the viral video or heard Maya's podcast. Judge Carla Mendez, a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s, questioned each candidate carefully. Some came wearing buttons supporting Ellie. Others expressed sympathy for Kane, claiming police officers faced impossible situations. One woman admitted she didn't trust the legal system to hold officers accountable. A man said he believed all protests were manufactured outrage. Judge Mendez dismissed them all, searching for jurors who could weigh evidence objectively despite their opinions. After 2 full days, they assembled a jury of 12, plus 2 alternates. On the morning opening statements were scheduled, Kane entered the courtroom wearing his full dress uniform despite his attorney's advice against it. He wanted to project authority, but the effect was different. He looked like a man clinging to an identity that no longer fit. Captain Ward sat in the gallery, her expression unreadable. She had testified before the grand jury about the recording she made. Now she waited to see if her career would survive her conscience. Daniel delivered his opening statement with controlled passion. He walked the jury through Ellie's afternoon at Morrison's, the payment terminal malfunction, the clerk's instructions to wait, and Kane's violent assumption of guilt. Judge Eleanor Brooks dedicated her life to justice, Daniel said, his voice carrying through the packed courtroom. She presided over thousands of cases with fairness and integrity. On that day, she became the victim of the very system she spent decades trying to perfect. She was not just wrongfully arrested. She was humiliated, injured, and treated as less than human because Officer Kane made assumptions based on the color of her skin rather than the facts before his eyes. He paused, letting his words settle. But this case is about more than one afternoon. It's about a pattern, a system that protected Officer Kane despite repeated complaints, a department that buried evidence of misconduct spanning 2 generations, and a city that chose silence over accountability again and again until Judge Brooks said enough. Kane's attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Richard Morrison, presented a different narrative. He painted Kane as a dedicated officer making split-second decisions in a difficult situation. He suggested Ellie had been uncooperative, that the arrest was a regrettable misunderstanding blown out of proportion by media sensationalism and political agendas. Officer Kane has served this community for 20 years, Morrison argued. He has faced danger, made sacrifices, and protected citizens who often show him no gratitude. On that day at Morrison's supermarket, he saw what appeared to be theft in progress. He acted on his training. Were there mistakes? Perhaps. But mistakes do not equal malice. And prosecuting good officers for doing their jobs in imperfect circumstances will only make our streets less safe. The jury listened, some nodding slightly, others frowning. The first witness was Marcus Doyle. He walked to the stand nervously, avoiding Kane's glare. Under Daniel's questioning, Marcus described the payment terminal malfunction and Brenda directing Ellie to wait by the table. "Did you try to explain this to Officer Kane?" Daniel asked. "Yes, sir. I approached him immediately, but he told me to step back. He wouldn't listen." "What were his exact words?" Marcus hesitated. He said, "Step back," and when I tried again, he said, "I said step back." He was very aggressive. I was afraid if I kept talking, he'd arrest me too. Under cross-examination, Morrison tried to suggest Marcus was biased, that he had financial incentive to support Ellie's lawsuit. But Marcus remained steady, his quiet honesty more powerful than any dramatic testimony. Next came the medical expert who examined Ellie's wrists. Dr. Patricia Reynolds explained the surgical scars from an old injury and how Kane's tight handcuffs had aggravated the area, causing significant pain and temporary loss of mobility. Morrison suggested Ellie might have been exaggerating her pain, drawing gasps from the gallery. Dr. Reynolds fixed him with a cold stare. "I've been a physician for 30 years. I know the difference between genuine injury and fabrication. Judge Brooks's injuries were real, documented, and entirely consistent with excessive force." Then came Karen Walsh, the woman who live-streamed the arrest. She described Kane's aggression, Ellie's calm attempts to explain, and the crowd's horror as an elderly woman was roughly handcuffed. "Everyone knew something was wrong," Karen testified. "People were trying to tell him, but he wouldn't listen. It was like he wanted to punish her." But the most powerful testimony came from Captain Regina Ward. Daniel called her to the stand, and the courtroom fell silent. Ward had risked her career by recording Ortega. Now she would risk it again by testifying honestly. "Captain Ward, how long have you served in law enforcement?" 32 years. "And in that time, have you encountered officers who abuse their authority?" Morrison objected. "Relevance, Your Honor." "I'll allow it," Judge Mendez said. "The witness may answer." Ward took a breath. Yes, I've encountered officers who let power corrupt them. Officers who see certain communities as enemies rather than people to protect. And I've watched the system protect those officers because acknowledging the problem feels like betraying the badge. Did you review Officer Kane's record before this incident? I did. After the arrest, I pulled his full file. What I found troubled me deeply. Daniel introduced the documents Ward had secretly copied. 6 formal complaints against Kane over 15 years. Each one involving excessive force. Each one mysteriously resolved without discipline. How is that possible? Daniel asked. Someone with access to the records system scrubbed them. Complaints were filed, investigations initiated, and then files were altered to show minor infractions or cleared entirely. Who had that level of access? Senior department officials. Possibly people outside the department with political connections. Morrison objected repeatedly, but the damage was done. The jury saw the pattern clearly. When Morrison cross-examined Ward, he tried to paint her as a disgruntled officer seeking revenge. But Ward's calm professionalism undermined every insinuation. "I'm not here because I'm angry," Ward said quietly. "I'm here because I took an oath to serve and protect. That includes protecting people from officers who abuse their power." The next day, Jamal Richards testified about his investigation into Thomas Kane. He presented newspaper articles, photographs, and witness statements from the 1970s showing a pattern of brutal treatment of protesters. "I interviewed 12 people who encountered Officer Thomas Kane during civil rights demonstrations," Jamal explained. "Every single one described unprovoked violence, beatings, racial slurs, deliberate humiliation." Daniel introduced Henry Lawson's military intelligence file. Henry took the stand, his military bearing evident despite his age. He described his investigation, the evidence he compiled, and how it was buried by political pressure. "I testified before a review board about Officer Thomas Kane's conduct," Henry said. "I believe the system would hold him accountable. Instead, the system protected him, and my career was quietly destroyed for doing my job." Did Judge Brooks preside over any proceedings related to Thomas Kane? Yes, a misconduct hearing in 1976. She ruled against him, recommended suspension and retraining. The department ignored her ruling completely. Morrison tried to discredit Henry's decades-old evidence, suggesting memories fade and documents can be unreliable. But the photographs and official reports spoke for themselves. Then Daniel called Chief Justice Langford. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Langford was a respected figure, and his willingness to testify carried enormous weight. Under oath, Langford admitted he had been pressured to dismiss police corruption cases 3 decades earlier, and that Ellie had protected him by taking those cases herself. "Why are you testifying today?" Daniel asked. Langford looked directly at Ellie. "Because I owe her a debt I can never fully repay, and because the truth matters more than my comfort or reputation." He authenticated the internal memos showing systematic protection of bad officers. The documents traced patterns across administrations, showing how complaints were buried, how evidence disappeared, and how officers like the Kanes were shielded generation after generation. The jury looked shaken. This wasn't just about one arrest anymore. It was about institutional rot. When Ellie finally took the stand, the courtroom felt like a church, silent and reverent. She walked slowly to the witness box, using her cane, and was sworn in. Daniel's questions were gentle, allowing Ellie to tell her story in her own words. She described shopping for ingredients to honor her late husband's memory. She explained the payment malfunction and the clerk's instructions. She recounted Kane's approach, his refusal to listen, and the pain of being handcuffed roughly. "When he grabbed your wrists, what did you feel?" "Physical pain," Ellie said simply, "but also something deeper. I felt the weight of every case I presided over where officers claimed they feared for their safety when confronting unarmed black citizens. I felt the weight of trying to be fair to both sides while knowing the system itself was tilted. And I felt sadness that after all these years, after all the progress we thought we'd made, I could still be seen as a threat simply because of my skin." Her voice never rose. She didn't cry or rage. She simply stated the truth with the same dignity she had brought to the bench for 40 years. Morrison's cross-examination was cautious. He couldn't attack Ellie directly without alienating the jury. Instead, he tried to suggest the arrest was a genuine misunderstanding. Isn't it possible, officer, Kane simply made an honest mistake? Ellie met his eyes calmly. An honest mistake is when you misread a situation and immediately correct it upon receiving new information. Officer Kane was given information repeatedly. He chose not to hear it. Why do you think that is? Objection, Daniel said. Calls for speculation. I'll rephrase, Morrison said. Judge Brooks, you've attributed Officer Kane's actions to racial bias. But isn't it possible he was simply doing his job as he understood it? Ellie was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. I've spent my career trying to be fair, Mr. Morrison. I've tried to see the humanity in everyone who appeared before me, whether they were defendants or officers. So I've asked myself that same question. Could this have been innocent? And the answer is no. The facts don't support it. The pattern doesn't support it. And my own lived experience doesn't support it. When Morrison tried to push further, Ellie added, but I will say this. Officer Kane is not uniquely evil. He's the product of a system that taught him who to fear and who to trust. That system failed him as much as it failed me. The difference is, I'm seeking accountability. He's seeking absolution without change. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Then came Kane's testimony. Morrison had debated whether to put him on the stand, but Kane insisted. He needed to tell his side. Under Morrison's friendly questioning, Kane described his perspective. He saw bags by the exit, assumed theft, and acted according to training. He insisted he didn't target Ellie because of race, but because of suspicious behavior. But under Daniel's cross-examination, cracks appeared. Officer Kane, when multiple witnesses tried to explain the payment malfunction, why didn't you listen? I was focused on the suspect. The suspect. You mean Judge Brooks, a 72-year-old woman with a cane? I didn't know who she was, but you knew she was elderly. You knew she had mobility issues. You knew witnesses were trying to explain. Why did you assume guilt? Kane's jaw tightened. In my experience, people near exits with unpaid merchandise are usually shoplifting. In your experience, based on what data? What training? Based on 20 years of police work. Daniel pulled up Kane's record. In 20 years, how many shoplifting arrests have you made at Morrison's supermarket? Kane hesitated. I don't know the exact number. 0, Officer Kane. You had made 0 shoplifting arrests at that location. So this wasn't based on experience. What was it based on? Kane's face flushed. I was doing my job. Were you angry that day? No. Were you angry at Judge Brooks specifically? Morrison objected, but the question hung in the air. Daniel shifted tactics. Officer Kane, did you know your father was investigated for police brutality in the 1970s? That was a witch hunt. My father was a hero. Was he? We've heard testimony about beatings, racial targeting, and deliberate cruelty. We've seen photographs. We've heard from witnesses. Was your father a hero? Or was he protected by the same system that protected you? Kane stood abruptly, his voice rising. My father served this city honorably. That judge, he pointed at Ellie. She tried to destroy his reputation because she had an agenda against cops. Judge Mendez banged her gavel. Officer Kane, sit down. Kane sat, breathing hard, but the damage was done. The jury had seen his rage, his resentment, and the generational hatred he carried. Daniel's voice was quiet now. You arrested Judge Brooks not because she was shoplifting, but because on some level, conscious or not, you wanted to punish her for what you believe she did to your father. Isn't that true? No, Kane whispered, but his conviction had shattered. No further questions. The trial recessed for the day. Outside, reporters surrounded both legal teams. Maya's latest podcast episode analyzing the testimony had already gone viral. Inside a courthouse bathroom, Kane stared at his reflection. His mother's words echoed. Your father wasn't the hero you think he was. And now, standing in a courtroom where his own actions were being dissected, he wondered if he was becoming the same kind of man. That evening, Ellie sat with Maya and Henry in her living room. The news played coverage of the trial, but she didn't watch. Instead, she looked at a photograph of William. Do you think we'll win? Maya asked. Win, lose, those are outcomes, Ellie said. What matters is we told the truth. The rest is up to the jury. Henry nodded. Whatever they decide, you've already won something more important. You've exposed a system that operated in darkness. You've given voice to people who've been silenced. That's victory enough. Maya hugged her grandmother tightly. I'm so proud of you. Ellie patted her hand. I'm proud of you too, sweetheart. You found your voice and used it for good. That's all any of us can do. The next day, closing arguments began. Daniel stood before the jury and summarized everything they'd heard. The facts, the pattern, the systematic cover-up. Officer Bradley Kane didn't just arrest Judge Brooks wrongfully, he concluded. He violated her civil rights. He caused her physical pain. He humiliated her publicly. And he did it because of assumptions rooted in prejudice and generational resentment. The city enabled this by protecting officers like Kane and his father for decades. Today, you have the power to say that ends now. You have the power to hold them accountable. Not with revenge, but with justice. Morrison gave his closing argument, appealing to sympathy for officers who face difficult situations daily. But his words felt hollow after everything the jury had heard. The jury deliberated for a full day. The wait was agonizing. Ellie remained calm outwardly, but Henry noticed her hands trembling slightly when she thought no one was looking. Finally, the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Kane sat stone-faced. Ellie sat with her hands folded, Maya beside her. Judge Mendez entered. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson stood. We have, Your Honor. On the claim of wrongful arrest. How do you find? We find in favor of the plaintiff, Eleanor Brooks. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. On the claim of excessive force? In favor of the plaintiff. On the claim of civil rights violations? In favor of the plaintiff. Each answer hit like a hammer. Kane's head dropped into his hands. Judge Mendez continued. And as to the city's liability for enabling this pattern of misconduct, we find the city liable, Your Honor. Ellie closed her eyes briefly, a tear sliding down her cheek. Not tears of joy, but of release, of validation, of knowing that truth had finally been heard. Judge Mendez set a date for the damages phase. This court will reconvene in 2 weeks to determine damages. However, I want to address something important now while we're all assembled here. She looked at Kane, then at the city's legal team. This case revealed systemic failures that cannot be ignored. I'm recommending a comprehensive review of complaint procedures, mandatory bias training, and an independent oversight board with real power. She banged her gavel. Court adjourned. Outside, supporters erupted in cheers. News crews jostled for position as Ellie emerged, supported by Maya and Henry. Someone started chanting her name. Others joined until the courthouse steps echoed with Brooks. Brooks! Brooks! Ellie raised her hand gently, and the crowd quieted. She spoke without a microphone, but her voice carried clear and strong. Today, justice was served, not just for me, but for everyone who has felt invisible in the face of power. But this is not the end. This is the beginning. Real change happens when we turn verdicts into action. The crowd applauded as she descended the steps carefully, cameras flashing like lightning against the gray courthouse stone. Maya hugged her grandmother tightly, tears streaming down her face. You did it, Grandma. You actually did it. Ellie held her close. We did it, sweetheart. Your voice, your courage, it all mattered. Henry stood nearby, his posture finally relaxed. Ellie extended her hand, and he took it. Thank you for keeping the faith all these years, she said quietly. Thank you for giving me a reason to use it. Across the plaza, Kane exited through a side door. Reporters spotted him, shouting questions. He pushed through without answering, his face a mask of anguish. Captain Ward watched from distance. She had hoped the trial might prompt genuine reflection. Instead, she saw only a broken man still clinging to denial. Inside a black sedan, Mayor Ortega sat watching through tinted windows. The verdict had sealed her political fate. It's over, her chief of staff said quietly. Ortega nodded. Draft my resignation letter. At Daniel Holt's office, he sat with case files spread before him. For years, he had rationalized compromises. But Ellie had shown him that some truths demanded to be spoken clearly, regardless of cost. His phone buzzed. A message from a public interest law firm offering him a position. He typed his acceptance without hesitation. At Morrison's supermarket, Marcus restocked shelves while customers passed. Some nodded respectfully. Others ignored him. The manager had congratulated him privately, but reminded him to stay professional. An elderly black woman approached him. "I just wanted to thank you," she said softly, "for speaking up. My son was arrested 5 years ago. No one believed him. What you did, it means something." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "I just told what I saw, ma'am." "That's more than most people do," she replied, squeezing his arm before walking away. That evening, Kane sat alone in his apartment, still in uniform, staring at his father's memorial plaque. His phone rang. His mother. He answered. "Bradley, I watched the verdict. Your father wasn't the man you thought he was. I should have told you years ago. He did terrible things. When that judge ruled against him, she was right." Kane's hand trembled. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you're becoming him. You're carrying his anger, his refusal to see black people as fully human. I can't watch you destroy yourself with hatred. I don't know how to be anything else. You start by admitting what you did was wrong. Until you admit that, you'll never be free." After she hung up, Kane sat in darkness. The uniform that once made him feel powerful now felt like chains. Slowly, he removed his badge and set on the table. Across town, Chief Justice Langford sat with colleagues who had watched the trial. "I only did what I should have done 30 years ago," he said. "If I'd had Ellie's courage back then, maybe none of this would have happened. You can't blame yourself for the system's failures." "Can't I? We all knew there were officers who shouldn't have badges. We told ourselves we were being pragmatic. But pragmatism in the face of injustice is just cowardice." Late that night, Ellie sat with Maya, Henry, and Daniel, who brought champagne. "I don't usually drink," Ellie said, accepting a glass. "But tonight seems appropriate." They toasted to justice. But as conversation flowed, Ellie grew quiet, staring at William's photograph. "What are you thinking, Grandma?" Maya asked. "About all the people who didn't get this outcome. The ones who were arrested, beaten, and no one cared. I won today, but what about them?" "That's why this matters," Henry said. "Your victory opens doors for them. It creates precedent." Daniel added, "I've already received calls from attorneys citing your verdict. You've given them ammunition." Ellie nodded. "Then we can't stop. The verdict is just one step." Maya pulled out her laptop. "I'm already planning a follow-up series. Tracking reforms, holding officials accountable." At the precinct, Captain Ward called a meeting with senior staff. Half the room looked relieved. The other half looked defensive. "I know some of you think this verdict was unfair," Ward began. "But we were judged by our own actions, our own failures to police ourselves." She distributed Judge Mendez's recommendations. "Starting tomorrow, we implement these reforms. Anyone who can't accept that should consider whether they're in the right profession." One officer spoke up. "Captain, this feels like we're admitting the whole department is corrupt." "We're admitting we failed," Ward replied. "Failure can be corrected. Denial makes it worse." In the city's poorest neighborhoods, people felt something they hadn't felt in years: hope. Not naive hope, but cautious hope that maybe their voices could matter too. At a community center, an impromptu gathering celebrated the verdict. Young activists discussed what came next. "She's 72 and didn't back down," one woman said. "What's our excuse?" The room buzzed with renewed energy. Back at Ellie's home, after everyone left, she sat alone. The house was quiet except for William's old clock ticking. She thought about the journey from Morrison's to this moment. The pain of handcuffs, the humiliation, the nights wondering if justice was worth the cost. Maya's threats, Marcus's fear, Henry's wounds reopened, and the verdict. Not just legal victory, but what it represented. Validation, acknowledgement, hope. She texted Marcus, "Thank you for your courage. It mattered." To Captain Ward, "Your integrity gives me hope." To Daniel, "Welcome to the right side of history." To Maya, "I'm proud of you. Never stop using your voice." She closed her eyes, exhausted but at peace. Justice had been served. Truth had been heard. And that was the foundation on which real change was built. 2 weeks after the verdict, the courthouse filled once again for the damages phase. The atmosphere felt different now, calmer, but weighted with anticipation. Everyone knew this final proceeding would determine not just monetary compensation, but the city's acknowledgement of decades of institutional failure. Ellie arrived early, wearing the same Navy suit from the trial. Maya walked beside her, carrying folders of documentation they had prepared over sleepless nights. Henry followed quietly, his military bearing a steady anchor in the chaos of camera flashes and shouted questions. Daniel Holt met them at the entrance, briefcase in hand, looking more confident than he had in years. "Ready for this?" he asked. "Always," Ellie replied with a slight smile. Inside, Judge Mendez reviewed the jury's liability findings before addressing the damages question. The courtroom was packed again, though the energy felt less confrontational now. The verdict had settled the question of guilt. Today was about consequences and compensation. Daniel presented medical bills totaling $8,000 for treatment of Ellie's wrist injury and ongoing physical therapy. He introduced documentation of Ellie's pain and suffering, medical records, journal entries she'd kept detailing sleepless nights and anxiety attacks she'd never experienced before the arrest. Expert testimony came from psychologists who explained the lasting trauma of being handcuffed and humiliated in public. But the most powerful evidence came from Ellie herself when Daniel called her to testify. "Judge Brooks, can you describe how this arrest affected your daily life?" Daniel asked gently. Ellie spoke calmly, but with undeniable emotion threading through her words. "I stopped going to Morrison's, the store I shopped at for 30 years. The place where I bought groceries to honor my late husband became a source of trauma. I found myself hesitating before leaving my home, wondering if today would be the day someone saw me as a threat rather than a person. I've spent my life believing in the justice system, working within it, trying to make it better. This experience shook that faith to its foundation." She paused, looking directly at the jury. "But more than the personal pain, I think about what this represents for others. Every black parent who's had to give their children the talk about police encounters. Every person who's been stopped, searched, or arrested for nothing more than existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The damage extends far beyond one afternoon in a supermarket." The jury listened intently, several members visibly moved. One woman in the front row wiped her eyes discreetly. Daniel then introduced evidence of the city's pattern of protecting officers despite complaints. He showed financial records of previous settlements paid quietly, buried in budget line items. Over the past 20 years, the city had paid out over $15 million in settlements, always with confidentiality clauses, always without admitting wrongdoing. He argued that meaningful damages would finally force real accountability rather than treating misconduct as just another budget expense. Kane's attorney, Morrison, tried to argue that the arrest was an isolated mistake deserving minimal damages. He suggested $50,000 would be sufficient compensation. But after the verdict established liability and pattern, his arguments felt hollow. The jury knew this wasn't about one officer's bad day. This was about generations of protected abuse. After brief deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. "We award compensatory damages of $500,000 for pain, suffering, and violation of civil rights," the foreperson announced, "and punitive damages of $1 million against the city for systematic enabling of misconduct." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. $1.5 million total. Judge Mendez nodded solemnly. "This award reflects not just compensation for harm, but a statement about institutional responsibility. Let it serve as a catalyst for real reform." She banged her gavel. "This court is adjourned." Outside, reporters swarmed. Ellie made a brief statement, her voice carrying across the courthouse steps. "This money doesn't erase what happened, but it sends a message that accountability matters. Half of this award will fund a legal defense fund for victims of police misconduct. It will be named after my late husband, William Brooks, who believed everyone deserves justice regardless of their ability to pay. Cameras flashed as she continued. To those who face similar situations, know this: your voices matter. Your pain is real, and there are people willing to fight alongside you. The crowd erupted in applause. Maya stood beside her grandmother, tears in her eyes. In the weeks following the damages award, the city transformed. Mayor Ortega's resignation had left a vacuum filled by interim leadership committed to reform. Captain Ward was promoted to acting chief, given a mandate to implement Judge Mendez's recommendations. Ward worked tirelessly. She established the Independent Oversight Board with real investigative power. She instituted mandatory bias training for all officers, not the perfunctory seminars of the past, but intensive programs designed to change culture. She purged corrupted personnel files and created transparent complaint procedures. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Some officers resigned, claiming they couldn't work under politically correct constraints. Ward let them go without regret. If transparency and accountability make you uncomfortable, she told one departing officer, then you're exactly who shouldn't be wearing this badge. Daniel Holt joined the public interest law firm and immediately took on 3 cases similar to Ellie's, using her verdict as precedent. His first client was a young man arrested for suspicious behavior while birdwatching in his own neighborhood. The case settled quickly once the city attorney saw Daniel's evidence and recognized the pattern Ellie's trial had exposed. "You taught me something," Daniel told Ellie over coffee one afternoon. "Integrity isn't convenient. It's costly, but the cost of compromising it is far higher." Ellie smiled. "You're learning. That's what matters." Maya's podcast exploded in popularity. Her follow-up series documenting the city's reform implementation became required listening for activists nationwide. She interviewed officers who supported change, community members affected by past misconduct, and experts on police accountability. One episode featured Marcus Doyle. He spoke about the pressure he faced for testifying, but also about the elderly woman who thanked him. "That moment made it worth it," Marcus said, knowing that speaking up mattered to someone who felt invisible. "That's why we have to keep doing it." The episode went viral, and Marcus received messages from people across the country sharing their own stories of witnessing injustice and struggling with whether to speak up. Henry Lawson spent his days visiting the community center, mentoring young activists. He shared his experiences from the 1970s, connecting past struggles to present fights. "The system protected itself then just like it tried to protect itself now," he told a group of college students. "But every generation that refuses to stay silent chips away at that protection. Judge Brooks chipped away a big piece. Now you have to keep chipping." The students listened with reverence, recognizing they were learning from someone who had fought these battles for decades. Kane disappeared from public view after removing his badge. He didn't contest the verdict or seek media sympathy. Instead, he began attending counseling sessions focused on inherited trauma and implicit bias. His therapist, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, worked with him to unpack the narratives he'd absorbed about his father, about policing, about race. "You were taught to see certain people as threats," Dr. Mitchell explained during one session. "That's not your fault. But what you do with that knowledge now, that's your responsibility." Kane started volunteering at a community center in a predominantly black neighborhood, not as a police liaison, but as someone doing grunt work, painting walls, moving furniture, serving meals. He didn't announce who he was. He simply showed up, week after week, trying to see people as people rather than threats. One afternoon, an elderly man at the center recognized him. "You're that cop," the man said, his tone neutral. Kane froze, waiting for anger or rejection. "Yes, sir, I am." The man studied him for a long moment. "You here for publicity?" "No, sir. I'm here because I don't know how else to start becoming someone different." The man nodded slowly. "Keep coming back, then. Redemption ain't a one-time thing. It's showing up." Kane returned every week. 3 months after the verdict, the William Brooks Legal Defense Fund officially launched with a ceremony at the community center. Ellie had donated $750,000, keeping only enough to cover her medical expenses and replace the savings depleted by the lawsuit. The fund would provide free legal representation to victims of police misconduct who couldn't afford attorneys. The ceremony drew over 200 people. Former clients from Ellie's judicial career came to show support. Young activists who had followed Maya's podcast attended, hoping to connect the movement to institutional resources. Officers who supported reform stood in the back, their presence a statement that change was possible. Daniel served on the fund's board of directors. Captain Ward provided expertise on departmental procedures and helped identify legitimate complaints. Maya handled outreach and publicity through her podcast and social media platforms. Within the first month, they received over 100 applications for assistance. The first case they took involved a teenager named Deshaun Williams, arrested for disorderly conduct while protesting outside a city council meeting. He had been advocating for better school funding in his neighborhood when officers surrounded the protesters and started making arrests. Deshaun's charges were eventually dropped after video evidence showed he had done nothing disorderly, but the arrest remained on his record, threatening his college applications and scholarship opportunities. Ellie attended the hearing where the record was expunged. She sat in the gallery, watching the young man's face as the judge struck the arrest from his file. His mother sat beside him, squeezing his hand. When the judge's gavel fell, declaring the record sealed and expunged, Deshaun's shoulders relaxed as if a physical weight had been lifted. He turned and saw Ellie, his eyes filling with tears. After the hearing, he approached her, his mother close behind. "Thank you, Judge Brooks," he said, his voice breaking. "Because of what you did, I get to keep my future. I got accepted to 3 colleges. Without your fund, I couldn't have afforded to fight this. I would have just lived with that arrest record forever." His mother embraced Ellie tightly. "You saved my baby's future. How do I thank you for that?" Ellie hugged them both gently. "You keep fighting for what's right. You teach your son that justice is worth pursuing. That's thanks enough." Chief Justice Langford retired 6 months after the trial. In his farewell speech, he spoke candidly about the debt he owed Ellie and the compromises he regretted. "I spent my career trying to be pragmatic," he said, "but I've learned that some principles can't be compromised. Justice delayed is justice denied, and silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Judge Eleanor Brooks taught me that lesson. I only wish I'd learned it sooner." He donated his personal files on police misconduct cases to the Legal Defense Fund, providing decades of documentation for future accountability efforts. Jamal Richards won a Pulitzer nomination for his investigative reporting on the Kane family and institutional corruption. But when he visited Ellie to share the news, he was characteristically humble. "Your story made this possible," he told her. "Your willingness to stand up and face it all publicly. That's the real story." Ellie shook her head. "The real story is what happens next. Whether the reforms hold, whether the culture actually changes. That's what you should keep reporting on." Jamal smiled. "Already on it." A year after the arrest, Ellie stood at the Morrison supermarket where everything began. The store had installed a memorial plaque near the entrance, brass and dignified, in honor of Judge Eleanor Brooks, who reminded us that justice requires courage, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to truth. The store manager had called her personally to invite her to the unveiling. When she arrived, a small crowd had gathered, regular customers who remembered that day, employees who had witnessed the arrest, and community members who had followed the trial. Marcus saw her looking at the plaque. He approached carefully, suddenly nervous despite having testified in court. "Judge Brooks? I'm Marcus. I don't know if you remember." "Of course I remember you, Marcus. You spoke up when it mattered most. That took tremendous courage." Marcus smiled, relieved. "I wanted to say thank you for fighting. It changed things for a lot of us. I got promoted to assistant manager last month. The new owner said what I did showed leadership. I never thought speaking the truth would lead to something good for me." They stood together, looking at the plaque, 2 ordinary people who had been caught in a moment that became a movement. That evening, Ellie cooked her late husband's stew again. The anniversary of his death had come around once more, but this time she invited Maya, Henry, and Daniel to share the meal. She wanted company, wanted to celebrate William's memory with people who understood what the fight had cost and what it had achieved. They sat around her kitchen table, talking about the year's changes, the challenges ahead, and the small victories that gave them hope. The stew simmered on the stove, filling the house with a rich, comforting scent of rosemary and thyme, smells that brought William back to her in memory, if not presence. The Oversight Board issued its first report today, Daniel mentioned. 2 officers are facing discipline for excessive force. The system is actually working. It's working because people are watching, Maya added. My listeners send me tips now. They're documenting everything. The transparency is making a difference. Henry raised his glass. To Eleanor, who showed us what courage looks like. They clinked glasses, but Ellie shook her head. Courage isn't singular. It's collective. Each of you contributed something essential. Marcus testified despite fear. Captain Ward risked her career. Chief Justice Langford released those files. Daniel chose integrity over advancement. Maya used her platform. It took all of us. She looked around the table at faces she'd come to cherish. That's the lesson. Change doesn't come from individual heroes. It comes from communities of people who refuse to stay silent. Later, as everyone prepared to leave, Maya hugged her grandmother tightly. What you did this year, Grandma, it's going to matter for generations. Ellie stroked her granddaughter's hair. What we did, sweetheart, and what we'll keep doing. After everyone left, Ellie sat alone with William's photograph. She lit the candle beside it and whispered into the quiet room. I hope you're proud, William. I hope wherever you are, you can see that the fight we both believed in is continuing. That justice, real justice, is still possible when people refuse to give up. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Ellie thought about Bradley Kane, somewhere out there trying to become better. She thought about the officers who quit rather than face accountability, and the officers who stayed and embraced reform. She thought about the young man whose record was expunged and the hundreds more who would receive help from the Legal Defense Fund. She thought about Morrison's supermarket and the plaque bearing her name, transforming a place of humiliation into a symbol of resistance. Most of all, she thought about the countless people who had faced similar injustices without platforms, without resources, without anyone to fight alongside them. People whose stories would never make headlines, but whose struggles mattered just as much. The verdict had been satisfying. The damages award had been significant. But the real victory was what came after. The reforms, the accountability, the cultural shift that made it harder for the next Bradley Kane to abuse power unchecked. At 73 years old, Ellie knew she wouldn't live to see perfect justice. Systems built over centuries didn't transform in years. But she had lived long enough to see change begin, to see cracks form in walls that once seemed impenetrable. She had lived long enough to watch her granddaughter find her voice and use it fearlessly. To watch men like Daniel Holt choose conscience over career. To watch institutions slowly, reluctantly, bend toward accountability. That was enough. Not perfect, but enough. Ellie stood slowly, using her cane, and walked to the window. Outside, her neighborhood lay quiet under streetlights. The same streets she'd walked for decades. The same homes filled with families she'd known for years. But something had shifted. Not dramatically, not completely, but undeniably. People looked at each other differently now. They believed, just a little more, that their voices could matter. That justice wasn't just for the powerful. Ellie smiled, a small, private smile in the darkness of her living room. We're not finished, she whispered to William's photograph, to herself, to the movement that continued beyond her. We're never finished, but we're further than we were. She extinguished the candle, watching the smoke curl upward and disappear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fights, new opportunities to choose courage over comfort. But tonight, she would rest. She had earned it. And somewhere in the city, in a community center, Bradley Kane painted another wall, his hands steady with the kind of work that might slowly redeem. In a newsroom, Jamal Richards typed the opening lines of his next investigation. In her apartment, Maya recorded the introduction to her next podcast episode. At the precinct, Captain Ward reviewed another complaint, determined to handle it transparently. And in neighborhoods across the city, people who had watched Ellie's fight felt just a little braver about speaking their own truths. The movement continued, carried forward by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Justice, Ellie had learned, wasn't a destination you reached. It was a direction you walked, step by step, day by day, with dignity and hope. And as long as people kept walking that direction, change remained possible. That, in the end, was everything. If the system had protected your pain the way it protected his power, would you have fought back, or would you have stayed silent? Like and subscribe for more stories that prove justice isn't given, it's demanded.